Hello and welcome to WordBirds, a birds of a feather conversation amongst people that care about words. Today on the show, Celia Hensman. Celia is the co-founder and director of the Disability Policy Center in the UK. Today we're going to talk about how the disabled represent the largest diversity group in the world and how you can listen to employee resource groups inside your business to help better define communication guidelines. And finally, how ableism is affecting and impacting your customer experience. Let's sit back and get some insight from the flock. Hello, Celia. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
This is a really interesting conversation that we're going to have today. But before we get started, I just want to move through the quick fire questions just to set the tone. Amazing content is
imaginative and collaborative.
Concise or descriptive?
Depends on the situation, I think.
The company with the best brand voice is?
Ooh, tricky. I can't say my own, can I? I would say the female lead.
Best piece of content advice for someone?
Draw on other people's knowledge, connect with other people.
And when I'm creating content, I always blank.
Think of something imaginative that hasn't been said before.
Fantastic. All right, Celia, welcome aboard. Let's talk a little bit about you. I have your bio in front of me, but I can't do it justice. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
So my name is Celia. I'm from the UK. I was born with a connective tissue disorder, which makes me a disabled woman, which has got worse as I've got older. It's very complicated. Nobody's ever heard of it. It's called Loeys-Dietz syndrome. Very weird and wonderful. I've been engaged kind of politically actively, I suppose, from a very young age, participating in select committees. I did a bit of work with Amnesty International when I was a teenager. And it all sort of snowballed into now me being the co-founder and director of the Disability Policy Center, which is the first think tank in the UK, and as far as we know in the world, that focuses on disability and accessibility. So putting the conversation around disability, ableism at the heart of government. So we work with Westminster, ministers, cabinet, policy leaders, companies and charities, to make sure that legislation is improved, amended, new legislation is brought in. So it's a pretty extensive job, it must be said. And then side to that, I do a lot of sort of campaigning work around disability and ableism and raising awareness, that sort of thing.
So I'd like to talk about the ableism aspect, because I think something that we tend to talk about and enterprises think a lot about is diversity and inclusion and how we build that into our content. And what you don't hear as much is ableism in language and in business content. Do you have any examples of how ableism is in everyday language?
I mean, it's absolutely rife. And I think the first thing I would say before we start is when you're talking about disability, 1 in 5 people in the UK are disabled. And when you take the global population of disability, it's larger than the population of China. It's over 15% of the world. Disability is the largest minority group in the entire world. So disability has to be part of the diversity conversation. And when you look at everyday language and the words that people are using, it's absolutely everywhere. There's very obvious things when people say, well, you don't look disabled, I never would have guessed, or you don't seem dyslexic, you can read so well and you seem so clever and you've got such a good job. And then there's other words where you can see it entrenched within our language that maybe people aren't quite so conscious of. So we use the word crazy and mental a lot in our language. You go, oh my gosh, that's mental, that's crazy. And it's absolutely everywhere. It's rife, and it's because of the origins of disability and the history of where it's come from has come from such a negative place. It wasn't a word to describe something. It was a word used to label people and put people in a box that there was something wrong with them. And I use that in inverted commas because obviously there's nothing wrong with being disabled. But it's the most diverse group there is in the world. Actually, the commonalities between us are so few and far between. What does unite us is the experiences that we've had and the ableism that we face in the world by things like, if you hop out of your car and you've got a blue badge and you're not in a wheelchair, someone is going to 99% of the time look at you funny or say something. It's absolutely everywhere, ableism.
So, I mean, I think as we create the words that we use for the business, we're good at identifying. I mean, the example that everybody uses is master slave in code, or the way that you built it in technical documentation. We're good at identifying things that are super obvious. How do you work with companies to find the things that aren't as obvious, that are identifying, I don't want to say triggers, but issues for people that you might not think of?
I think that the biggest takeaway is that disabled people are noticeably absent from conversation, and a lot of that is rooted in systemic differences where disabled people aren't at the top of business, and they're not in the FTSE 100, they're not in the managerial positions because the medical model of disability isn't alive and well. But it's about communication and consultation. You've got to speak to the people that have that lived experience, and you've got to collect that data from those individuals. As a society, we are at a point in society where we now understand what's okay and not okay when we're talking about race, when we're talking about gender, when we're talking about sexuality, all of the other social movements. We're at a place where, as human beings, we have an innate understanding of what is right and wrong. The disability side of social movement isn't at that point yet, where there isn't that intrinsic knowledge. You know, I look at the words I used when I was at school, and I'm obviously not going to say them now, but there were words that were part of our repertoire that were, you know, they weren't offensive, they were slang, and we threw them about because no one was educating us about disability. So what we have to do at this point of the social movement is people don't have that intrinsic knowledge yet. So we have to speak to the people that do have that lived experience, and therefore the intrinsic knowledge of what they think is acceptable and what they think isn't acceptable, because they are the best people to tell you. So from a business perspective, ERGs, employee resource groups, are one of the best ways to go. And then, you know, companies turn around and say, well, we don't actually have any disabled people on our team. And my response is, you probably do, because it's 1 in 5 people, but they've just not declared anything. And if you actually don't, then I think you need to look at yourself as an organization if you haven't got even a single person that can lead a conversation.
And I think because it's a newer area, it's not like compliance where there is a right and a wrong. It's easy to, I think, go in directions that may or may not work. So talking to the people that work in your organization is really important, because, I mean, disabled person versus person with disabilities.
Yeah.
Who makes that decision? It is not a mathematical equation. It's a decision that individuals make. How do you bridge that gap?
It's the thing about disability conversation, and this is me kind of waving up a white flag saying people are going to make mistakes around the language. And that goes back to what I was saying before about the fact that the disabled community is so diverse. And, you know, I have a physical health condition and I'm also neurodiverse, but I have no idea what it's like to live with a visual impairment or a hearing impairment. But under kind of legalities, I'm in the same category as that person. And we have very different experiences to one another, yet we're banded together. And I think my answer to that is go with what the majority look for, but respect that in individual situations, there may be individuals that say, actually, you know, when referring to me, could you use this language instead? And I think it's very important that as a society, we show that we are open to individualism, that it's not always a blanket approach to everything. And it's about getting to know people as well. There's something called the medical and the social model of disability, which really ties into ableism. And currently we're living in this weird in-between state where we're trying to shift from one to the other. So the medical model said that disabled people can't do things because of their disability. It's because of who they are. It's what their makeup it is. It's got nothing to do with society. It's just you can't do it because you're disabled. The social model says actually people are being disabled by society. So the barriers you have put in place and the way you speak to me and the preconceived notions that you have of me are what makes me living with a disability difficult. It's not the disability itself. Of course, medically there are challenges that I wish I didn't have, but that's not what's inhibiting me in society. It's what you've done. It's the barriers that you've put in place. And ableism in language ties into that completely.
So looking at the creation of a customer experience, for instance, a digital customer experience, you can actually block people from having that customer experience, or at least experiencing a positive customer experience just by the way that you communicate without even thinking about it. You're just making it more challenging for people to see themselves in that experience.
100%. And, you know, a really easy example to give is quite often when you're applying for a job or you're filling out a form or you're attending an event, do you have a disability that we need to be aware of? And it's a drop-down list and it's a single check option. That's ableism right there. I have multiple disabilities, but 99% of the time, you best believe that those forms are going to let me click one of those options, and I have to sort of pick which one am I going with today is my one that's likely to affect me most at whatever I'm doing and I'm signing up for. That's an
and then
example.
the spectrum of your options is so huge that what does it mean? Yes, I have a disability. What do you do? How do I use that information on the other end if it could be a hearing issue versus far the other side of the spectrum? I've asked you one question.
Exactly. And that one question, getting it wrong, has already told me that as an organization, you are not educated and you are not conscious and you're not actually that accessible as an organization. It makes me wonder, well, why are you asking me that question? Are you actually going to provide the reasonable adjustments, or are you just collecting data on me? And the fact that you haven't got that one question right tells me that it's the former. You're just collecting data on me and you don't actually care.
Well, and I'd love to think that that's just, small new companies that are having that challenge. But up until recently, big, huge companies that I don't want to name for all kinds of reasons didn't have diversity statements included, or didn't have in their diversity statement a statement on disability. So it's not just the small companies; it's the very large companies. So how do you move from a single, like, there are people listening right now that are thinking, oh, I do have a single checkbox. How would you even start to move from a single checkbox to being able to be inclusive in this space?
One of the biggest, I think, challenges that disabled people face is misconceptions. It's how people from the outset view us. So, for example, if we talk about dyslexia and other learning differences, instantly, intrinsically, as human beings, we go to struggle with reading, struggle with writing, probably can't think that quickly, not very clever, yada, 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 work very slowly, when actually that's not always the case at all. And dyslexic people are perfectly capable of living a full and enriched lives, but it's that intrinsic understanding of what that means. Or if you declare that you have a long-term health condition and that you've got to, might have periods off sick or whatever it may be, people's minds instantly go to, they are not a reliable person. They are not a person that I can count on. They're probably going to take lots of time off. So what has to be done from the outset is raising awareness, not always talking about the difficulties of being disabled and the barriers that there are, but also highlighting how capable we are as people. And if you look at language around disability, something that I can't stand is that when people are referring to the opposite of disabled people, they don't say non-disabled people, they say able-bodied people. That infers that I am, just that word able infers that I am not an able individual. I am disabled and you are abled. Something so simplistic as that language creates this kind of stance in society that automatically you think we aren't competing in the same environment and we are less intelligent, less able, less capable, purely because of how we were born or what we acquired later in life.
So I see the challenge, right? Because on the one hand, I feel uncomfortable asking the question, are you disabled? What is your disability? Because if I do that, I'm going to give myself the ability to have these preconceived notions versus saying, okay, well, I'm looking at you and you look fine, which isn't the right answer, because that doesn't support the way your work style, the way that you're going to communicate the experience that you're looking for. I assume this is the work that you do when you work with companies and governments to help people walk this line. Can you talk a little bit about how you help companies or government organizations or the UN walk this line to be inclusive without being offensive, without creating preconceived notions, and allowing people to have the experience they want to have?
Exactly. And I'm a bit of a bit of a history policy data freak. And to me, the answer, first and foremost, lies in the data. So one of the recent projects we did, Access2Funding, which we're still working on, is looking at disabled entrepreneurialism. And statistically, disabled people are much more likely to set up their own companies because of the barriers in employment, that theoretically it would be easier to be able to work for ourselves and work around our own lives and our own things that we have to take care of. And one of the statistics that we found is only 16.7% of disabled people feel like they have the same access to opportunities and outcomes as non-disabled people. 16%. So what we do is we collate this data together, we collate these experiences with roundtables, with policy leaders, with influential individuals, with the general populace, and we culminate it and formulate it all together into lovely shiny policy paper documents that are very long. So if anybody ever wants to go and read them, read the executive summary so that you're not drowned out. And then we take that forward to number 10, or we take that forward to ministers or policy leaders. It doesn't have to be someone governmental. There are policy leaders throughout our society that are independent of the government as well. And what we say is, this is the data. This is what's happening. And this data has never been collected before. And that's kind of why we set up as an organization. We were saying, why is this data not being collected? One of the really good examples I give you is that when you Google founder on, a search engine, and you say female founder or black female founder, so many results come up, and it's amazing to be able to see the work that's going on. When you Google disabled founder, I think there's something like 400 million less results. They are out there, they're just not getting the profile and the opportunities that they need. So what we do is we take all this data and we take it to the policy experts and say, as a country, we are losing about 14% of our GDP because we aren't utilizing disabled entrepreneurs. And someone can't argue with that. Someone can't turn around and say, well, it's pretty small. And actually what we're doing is painting a picture of how devastating and how much we are hemorrhaging as a society economically, also from an equality and morality perspective, that as the 14th most developed country in the world, you'd think that we need to prioritize, and we are seeing that shift starting to happen, but that shift needs to happen quicker. And that's kind of why we're here as an organization, is trying to speed that momentum up, because currently it's just moving too slowly.
Wow. Okay. That is, what you're doing is very individual and very important, and you can't argue with the numbers. That's the thing, is that there is specific gain to be had if this is handled correctly. If it's ignored, there's a phenomenal loss. Mm-hmm. Very, very interesting. So I think I want to jump to the PSOTD, because I think that whatever you're going to say next is probably going to be interesting. Provocative statement of the day, something that a position you hold that may or may not be super popular, that's just going to get people thinking.
I say this quite frequently, but it's about showing up for yourself. And I've previously not had that attitude to myself, and I've always put my work first, other people around me always first, and I forget about myself. And what I've realized is that I can't be the most productive that I want to be unless I show up for myself first, and I prioritize myself and my own well-being. And yes, that's because I've got other things to be worrying about. I can't eat or drink anything. It's very bizarre. I'm fed completely artificially, so I have to show up for myself. But in that, I've changed my attitude around what's achieving and what's accomplishing something, because we're constantly striving for that next thing. And you sit back and you've had a quiet day and you think, oh, I didn't do anything today. And actually, my priority today was showing up for myself, and I tidied my house and I did the day-to-day tasks that I needed to do. And in myself, I took that mental rest and that mental break, which meant I was able to come back stronger. And I think more people need to adopt that attitude of showing up for themselves and being their best ally.
That's a great position to take. And I think that a lot of people don't think that way. It's about dealing with everything that's around you. And I see this here at work. I see that out in the world. There's so much to do, and I've got to solve everybody else's problems first, and I'm left behind. And you can't be the best version of yourself if you're doing everything for everybody else. And I think especially in a case where, the things that you're biting off are so huge and so important, and the companies and organizations you're working with are so big that the value that you provide is predicated on your ability to show up for you first. If you don't do that, I think all of this is going to be muted. Celia, thank you for showing up. Thank you for being on the show. This has been a fantastic episode, and I would be excited to bring you back in the future to talk more about this.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to WordBirds. WordBirds is hosted by Chris Willis, produced by Charlotte Baxter-Reed, and brought to you by Acrolinks. For more information on Acrolinks, visit www.acrolinks.com.